There are many events in the world at the moment that are hard to take. Events where we would like to learn from history and literature to live well today. And in this video, I'm going to point you to one book that can help you do that. Inga Clendinin's Reading the Holocaust. There are so many events in the world today that are hard to take. Many horrors that are hard to watch. Many emotions can overwhelm us. In fear, we freeze. Our hearts can turn to stone. No doubt, the most difficult of these events are unfolding in Israel, Gaza, and Palestine. In due course, the International Court of Justice will decide the question of whether those events represent a genocide. In time, history will judge, as it always does, with ambiguity. But the daily witnessing of horrors has provoked moral dilemmas for us all. How do we respond to these events occurring on our watch? How do we face these monstrous events and not turn our hearts to stone? Witnessing these events has many effects on people. They sadden some, they shock others, they sap the will, they paralyse, for a few, they galvanise, they confirm the righteousness of a cause, they deepen beliefs that the enemy is a monster, they incite and justify more violence. I hear many people say world news is too much to bear at the moment. The world is depressing. We yearn for escape. The escape may be fantasy. It may be fiction. It may also be distorted history, which reassures our consciences that we are the exception to Solzhenitsyn's dictum, that the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart. Others say people who refuse to bear the tragic news, who avert their eyes from evil, are irresponsible. For some, it is shameful to sit back and let Gaza happen, is to commit the mistakes of Hitler's willing executioners in the 1930s and 1940s. How can they permit such events to happen when atrocious images are shared ubiquitously on anti-social media? Why do they, it is never we, refuse to gaze into the eyes of the monster? Others react to the accusation that they permit crimes against humanity with outrage and indignation. People like us cannot do things like that, they might say. The protesters are the true evil ones. They share a bed with the monster. They are anti-Semites. In Australia, the government and universities have even established an investigation into anti-Semitism among critics and protesters about Gaza on campus. Will it chill the free, open inquiry necessary to understand morally complex history and the many-sided conflicts of Israel and Palestine? One of Australia's leading historians, Henry Reynolds, thinks so. Then there is the mystery of why nobody in power, in a position of power, can seem to stop the killing. Why does the United Nations complain but not intervene? Why does the USA wring its diplomatic hands but stage standing ovations in Congress for the main authoriser of the killing? Our institutions have turned into stone rather than respond humanely. There are many better informed people on the Israel-Palestine conflict than me, but over recent weeks I have been reading The Holocaust by Inga Clendenin. Her book uses the term Gorgon effect to describe the way our hearts can turn to stone when contemplating the worst that we can do in war, in power, and in our own imaginations. It refers to the paralysing inability to observe reality and horror honestly and responsibly. It is based on the old Greek myth of the Gorgon or Medusa, the snake-haired monster whose face, if gazed upon, would turn even the toughest culture warrior to stone. In the beginning of that book, Inga Clendenin, a great Australian historian, wrote, "I want to dispel the Gorgon effect, the sickening of imagination and curiosity, and the draining of the will, which afflicts so many of us when we try to look squarely at the persons and processes implicated in the Holocaust. This Gorgon effect has paralysed the humane feelings of too many on all sides of too many conflicts. Overcoming the Gorgon effect is the moral obligation of our time, and perhaps of all times in history. And it can be done with one of the great virtues taught by history, that is, empathy." The most remarkable thing about Clendenin's book is how she practiced empathy. She sought to understand both victim and perpetrator, both witness and silent bystander. She looked into the face of the real Gorgon, not some sentimental, ideological myth which we can claim limply can never happen again. She wrote, "Humankind saw the face of the Gorgon in the concentration camps, petrifying the human by its denial of the human, both in itself and its prey. We must do more than register guilt or grief or anger or disgust, because neither reverence for those who suffer nor revulsion from those who inflict suffering will help us overcome its power to paralyse and to see it clearly." She wrote this profoundly empathetic book after a cultural scandal in Australia of a prize-winning book, The Hand That Signed the Paper, written by Helen Demidenko, whose real name was Darvel. Helen Demidenko dressed herself in fake Ukrainian heritage to excuse Ukrainian nationalist mass killings at Babi Yar and Treblinka as responses to Jewish, communist or Soviet oppression. Progressive, liberal-minded Australia swallowed this nonsense whole. An odd conservative thinker, Robert Mann, exposed the hope and lamented Australia's culture of forgetting, a culture that is perhaps ubiquitous around the Western world today. "We suffered," he wrote, "not only a dangerously low level of political and historical understanding in Australian intellectual culture, but a disturbing lack of critical acuity and moral poise." Sound familiar? 30 years later, Australian intellectual culture global intellectual culture, or Western intellectual culture, has fallen into the abyss. Clendenin wrote Reading the Holocaust because, in part, she too had been seduced by the story of the hand that signed the paper. She had refused full imaginative engagement with horrors that were unthinkable. She wrote her book so readers could feel them in their full monstrosity. Clendenin assumed on our behalf the moral obligation to stare into the eyes of the Gorgon and not be petrified. She wrote, "In the face of a catastrophe of this scale, so deliberately inflicted, perplexity is an indulgence we cannot. Today's Australian government, many other Western-aligned, United States-aligned governments, however, stand with Ukrainian ethno-nationalists and indulge in perplexity on Gaza. Australia's and other countries' latest abstention on the UN vote on the occupation of Palestine demonstrates again that in fear we fawn on the USA. I regret it is beyond the moral capacity of the Australian government, our ambassadors to the United Nations, to the United States, many community leaders, many political leaders around the world, to pick up Clendenin's admirable book. But it's not beyond the moral capacity of the viewers of this video. I highly recommend you read this book. There's a link to my description of it in my Substack below, where you can join me as a subscriber, and also to where you can obtain this book online. Thanks for watching.